The signing ceremony for a $4.4 billion merger was supposed to be the most important day of Victoria Kingsley's career. When mechanic Owen Pike walked through the conference room door in a grease-stained uniform, his hands still dark with engine oil, Victoria barely glanced at him before asking her assistant to remove him. This meeting, she told the room, was reserved for people with actual decision-making power. A few executives laughed. Owen set his folder on the table and turned to leave. Then the lead attorney for Wainwright Aerodyne stood and announced that the deal could not proceed without the signature of the patent trust's controlling owner. Stay until the end to find out why a single-dad mechanic held the power of life and death over a $4.4 billion deal. Owen Pike arrived at Evergreen Field before sunrise, moving through the pre-flight inspection of a test aircraft with the kind of deliberate focus that only comes from years spent listening to engines instead of managing spreadsheets in boardrooms. The plane was scheduled to appear in a public demonstration tied to the announcement of Kingsley Aviation's acquisition of Wainwright Aerodyne, and every manager on the property had spent the previous week making sure nothing would interfere with the ceremony's optics. Owen's job that morning had nothing to do with the merger, and everything to do with what the Hollis Pike Propulsion Trust had tasked him to verify since the day Samuel handed him the charter, that the Ether 9 engine inside that airframe was fit to fly. Midway through the power-up sequence, he felt something, a vibration at the high-thrust phase, barely perceptible, the kind of frequency that automated diagnostics almost always misses because it falls just outside the standard deviation threshold. The system showed green across every channel, but Owen trusted what his hands told him more than what any screen reported, and what they told him was that something was wrong. He called a halt to the pre-flight, and immediately drew a reaction from the two facility managers stationed nearby, who pointed out that the aircraft needed to be airborne within 4 hours for the ceremony, and that canceling the demonstration would embarrass both companies in front of investors, journalists, and government officials who had already been seated in the viewing area. Owen didn't argue. He simply pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, opened the engine cowling himself, and began a manual inspection of each thermal stage, working from the rear compressor forward with the methodical patience that had earned him a reputation among every crew he had ever supervised. What he found 40 minutes later was a thermal gasket in the number 3 combustion sleeve that had deformed under repeated heat cycling. Not enough to cause an immediate failure, but enough that after another 50 hours in the air, the structural fatigue could cascade into something no pilot would survive. He logged the finding, flagged the component for replacement, and grounded the aircraft on his own authority as the trust's technical designee. Because the inspection ran long, Owen arrived at the Wainwright Corporate Center in his work uniform. Dark navy coveralls with the Evergreen Field emblem on the left chest, steel-toed boots, and hands that no amount of shop soap had fully cleaned. Dorian Lockwood had quietly removed Owen's name and actual title from the official guest manifest weeks earlier, listing him only as a technical support representative from the trust, which meant no one at the reception desk recognized him as anything other than a maintenance worker who had wandered into the wrong corridor. The receptionist pointed him toward a side entrance while executives in tailored suits gathered near the windows overlooking Puget Sound, accepting drinks and exchanging congratulations for a deal none of them had yet signed. Owen navigated his way to the signing room just as the session was being called to order, stepping through the double doors at the exact moment Victoria Kingsley was adjusting her notes at the head of the conference table. She looked up, took in the uniform, the boots, the oil-dark hands, and made her assessment in roughly 2 seconds. She tilted her head toward her assistant and said, quietly but not quietly enough, that someone from maintenance had apparently come in through the wrong entrance and would need to be directed out. Owen extended his right hand in greeting, a straightforward gesture he had offered 1,000 times in machine shops and hangars, and Victoria looked at his palm, visibly marked with grease along the lifeline, and kept both her own hands at her sides, turning back to her notes as though he had already left the room. Several executives near the window exchanged glances, and one of them laughed, a short and dismissive sound that filled the silence where the handshake should have been. Owen lowered his hand, picked up the file folder he had carried from Evergreen Field, and began moving toward the door with no expression on his face, because there was no point staying in a room where a person had already decided what you were. He had taken no more than 3 steps when the senior counsel for the Wainwright legal team rose from his chair at the far end of the table and said, in a voice that brought every conversation in the room to an immediate stop, that the signing could not commence, and in fact could not be legally scheduled, until the controlling owner of the Hollis Pike Propulsion Trust was seated and confirmed willing to proceed. Every head in the room turned. Victoria's legal director, Mara Ellison, was already on her feet, pulling a bound document from her case and placing it in front of Victoria without hesitation. Not the summary version that had been circulating through the negotiation for 6 months, but the foundational licensing agreement that governed what happened to those patents the moment the company holding them changed hands. Mara read 3 provisions aloud, slowly and clearly. The Hollis Pike Propulsion Trust retained final approval rights over any change of controlling ownership in any company licensed to manufacture Ether 9 variants. The Trust's designated representative held a 51% voting interest in all licensing decisions, and no transfer of production rights was legally valid without a witnessed, notarized signature from the Trust's managing trustee, whose name, on every version of the document, was Owen Pike. Victoria sat very still in the way that happens when a person realizes they have made a serious miscalculation in a room full of witnesses, and there is no version of the next 60 seconds that does not cost something significant. She had publicly dismissed the one person whose cooperation was not optional, not a formality, not a courtesy, but a legal prerequisite that her own preparation should have surfaced weeks ago. Dorian Lockwood moved quickly to contain the moment, stepping forward and telling the room in a confident, measured voice that this was a procedural matter already addressed in the pre-negotiation communications, and that Owen's presence at the ceremony confirmed his agreement in principle. Owen set his file folder on the conference table, took the empty chair that Mara indicated, and said in the same unhurried tone he used when explaining engine faults to junior mechanics that he had not agreed to anything, because he had never received the safety evaluation documentation or the post-merger workforce plan he had requested in writing 3 months earlier. The room went quiet in a different way than before, not the silence of people suppressing amusement, but the silence of people recalculating every assumption they had made about how this day would end. Cyrus Wainwright, seated to Victoria's left, turned to look at Dorian with an expression that carried no welcome in it, because Dorian had told him privately and repeatedly that the trust had reviewed the structure and raised no formal objections. Victoria asked Owen if he would be willing to continue the meeting with the correct documentation made available. Owen said he would remain in the room because he had no interest in destroying the merger, only in understanding what it actually proposed to do with the technology he and Samuel Hollis had spent a decade building from nothing. Mara then opened the merger appendix to a tabbed page and placed it in front of Owen, and something on that page stopped her cold. The page described Owen's role in the trust as a non-voting technical advisor, a classification that did not appear anywhere in the original propulsion agreement, and that, if accepted, would have stripped him of the very rights the room had just spent several minutes confirming he held. Dorian had inserted the language. Victoria had not been shown it. And the entire $4.4 billion structure, built around a version of the trust that bore no relation to the actual document, was resting on language that Owen had every right to contest before any court in the state, before a single pen touched paper. Dorian announced that if the deal was not executed within 48 hours, Kingsley Aviation would be in technical default on a bridge loan that carried an accelerated repayment clause, and that the resulting cash pressure could force the company into a restructuring that would be far more damaging than any delay caused by a procedural dispute. 14 years before the day he walked into that conference room in a mechanic's uniform, Owen Pike had been the youngest aerodynamic systems engineer at a small research cooperative in Bellevue, working most nights in a converted warehouse alongside an older man named Samuel Hollis, who believed, with a conviction that bordered on the absolute, that jet propulsion had been engineered for speed and power at the expense of every other metric that actually kept people alive. Samuel had spent 4 decades watching components fail, accident investigations get softened by legal departments, and safety margins get trimmed to accommodate production timelines, and he had concluded that the only way to fix the problem was to build an engine that made cutting corners structurally impossible, not through regulation, but through design. Owen shared that belief and brought to it an engineer's appetite for precise, exhausting work. He spent 18 months developing the thermal equilibrium architecture that became the backbone of what they eventually called the Ether 9, a hybrid combustion design that reduced fuel consumption by 31%, while pushing the engine's operational reliability ceiling to a level the industry had not thought achievable without sacrificing range. When early prototypes began generating serious interest from major manufacturers, pressure to license quickly and launch commercially came from every direction at once. Investors, procurement offices, aerospace executives who pointed to the performance data and asked, in tones that were not really questions, why 2 engineers in a warehouse were holding back a technology that could reshape the industry. Owen had one answer. The testing cycle was not finished, and he would not approve a licensing structure that allowed the engine to enter service before the long-duration thermal stress data was complete. Samuel backed him fully, and the two of them held that line for 2 more years, while the technology matured and the impatient couple moved elsewhere. It was during those same 2 years that Owen's wife, Emily, was diagnosed with a degenerative condition that progressed faster than any of her physicians had predicted, and Owen quietly reorganized his entire life around her care without asking Samuel to alter the work arrangement or telling anyone outside his immediate family what that reorganization was costing him. After Emily died, Owen stayed in the house they had bought in a quiet neighborhood north of Seattle, and when Samuel offered to bring him back to the trust in a full-time capacity, Owen declined, choosing instead the mechanic's position at Evergreen Field that gave him fixed hours and a commute short enough to be home when Paige finished school each afternoon. He continued advising Samuel on the technical side of the trust, reviewed every new licensing application, and held the same standards they had always held. But he did it from a workbench rather than a boardroom, and that distinction was invisible to anyone who had not read the foundational trust documents with any care. Samuel had made Owen managing trustee 2 years before his death specifically because Owen had demonstrated, through decisions that cost him money and influence on multiple occasions, that he would not trade safety standards for personal convenience, and Samuel had seen enough of the industry to know that was rarer than any patent. Owen had been offered substantial sums for his share of the trust's licensing income more than once, and declined each time, accepting a fixed annual draw and directing the remaining royalty income into a research endowment and an engineering scholarship that bore Samuel's name. He was not, by any realistic measure, a poor man, but he lived without the markers that most conference rooms use to sort people into categories worth listening to and categories that can be escorted out. That invisibility was precisely what Dorian Lockwood had constructed his entire plan around. When Owen reviewed the merger documents that afternoon, he found the specific language he had been watching for. A clause buried in the post-acquisition operational plan that permitted the acquiring entity to modify Aether 9 component specifications without trust review, which was the exact provision Samuel had made a founding condition of every licensing agreement the trust had ever signed. Samuel's charter was unambiguous on this point. The trust could not authorize production under any ownership structure that removed the core engineering team's independent reporting line or permitted specification changes without technical sign-off. Victoria requested a private meeting with Owen the following morning, in a small conference room with no other Kingsley executives present, and began by saying she owed him a direct apology. She had dismissed him based on what he was wearing and what she assumed that meant about his standing in the room, and she acknowledged that without qualification. Owen listened until she finished, then told her that the apology was noted, but that the handshake was the least of what needed to be addressed. If Victoria had been prepared in front of her own senior team to treat a person that way because of their uniform, it suggested a pattern of judgment that likely ran much deeper than a single discourteous moment. And patterns like that had a way of producing exactly the kind of blind spots that allow someone like Dorian to operate undetected for years. Victoria did not offer a defense. She said she had been operating under sustained pressure to close the deal before the loan deadline, and had allowed that pressure to make her careless in ways she should have caught. Owen acknowledged the honesty without treating it as a resolution, then placed 3 pages from his own file on the table between them. The first was the trust's founding charter with the relevant clauses underlined. The second was his written request from 3 months earlier asking for the safety evaluation and workforce plan, with Dorian's office listed as the recipient and no acknowledgement on record. The third was a summary of the thermal gasket failure he had found the previous morning, a component from the most recent approved supply batch, which meant the problem was not isolated to one aircraft. Owen said he was not prepared to sign anything, but he was prepared to tell her exactly what conditions would need to be in writing before he would consider it. The conditions were specific: an independent safety audit of all active Aether 9 units before any public demonstration, a binding post-merger workforce plan with retention commitments for the core engineering team, a prohibition on sub-licensing the Ether-9 patents to any third party without trust approval, a requirement that all specification changes be reviewed by a technical board that included trust representation, and a guarantee that safety reporting channels within the combined company would remain independent of financial management. Victoria said the conditions were reasonable and that she would instruct Mara to begin drafting amendments immediately. Dorian intercepted the discussion in the hallway outside, telling Victoria that accepting Owen's conditions would signal to Julian Prescott at Prescott Horizon Capital that the deal was unstable, and that Prescott had made it privately clear that he would pull the loan facility if the asset structure, specifically the Ether-9 licensing arrangement, was altered in any way. Margaret Ashbourne called Victoria separately that afternoon and told her with characteristic directness that the board's patience for delay was limited, that the company's creditors were already anxious, and that if the merger failed because of conditions imposed by someone with no fiduciary responsibility to Kingsley Aviation, the board would have no choice but to discuss the CEO position. Victoria asked Mara to pull every document filed during the merger process. All of them, starting with the ones Dorian had submitted on her behalf. What Mara found in the filing archive took her most of the night to fully map, and when she presented it to Victoria the following morning, she did so with the calm, careful language of someone who understood that the words she was choosing would determine what happened next to several thousand people's livelihoods. There was a supplemental agreement, buried in the secondary financing documents that had been executed using Victoria's digital authorization during a period when Dorian had operational signing authority for routine correspondence. The document was not routine. It committed Kingsley Aviation, upon completion of the Wainwright acquisition, to a side arrangement with Prescott Horizon Capital, under which Prescott would provide $1.6 billion in acquisition financing in exchange for an option to purchase the Ether-9 patent portfolio at a fixed price within 36 months of closing. The option price was structured to be exercisable far below projected market value. The arrangement also contained a provision allowing Prescott to designate which Wainwright facilities remained operational, effectively giving an outside investment fund the authority to close the manufacturing plant and release the 2,000-plus workforce without any obligation to the existing employment agreements. The document had Victoria's electronic signature on it. Victoria stated flatly that she had never seen it. Dorian's response, delivered in a subsequent meeting with the full merger committee present, was that the signature had been applied under standard operational delegation protocols during a high-volume document period, and that its use was entirely within the scope of his authority. Cyrus Wainwright, who had agreed to sell his company on the explicit understanding that his employees would be protected, sat at the far end of the table and said nothing for a long moment before stating that the purpose of the sale had been to find a partner who would carry the company forward, not a structure that would strip it down for parts and deliver the intellectual property to a capital fund with no aerospace expertise. Dorian pointed out that if Cyrus attempted to terminate the agreement, the outstanding debt on Wainwright's balance sheet would come due immediately, and the company would have no mechanism to meet it. Owen, seated across from Dorian, understood the full geometry of the plan for the first time. The merger had never been about building a stronger aviation company. It had been constructed as a pipeline to move the Ether 9 patents out of the trust's reach and into a financial structure where they could be monetized, subdivided, and sold without reference to the safety conditions Samuel had spent a career building into the licensing framework. Every delay in providing Owen with the documents he had requested, every attempt to reclassify his trust role, every piece of language minimizing his authority in the merger appendix, all of it had been designed to get the deal signed before Owen understood what he was being asked to authorize. Dorian then told Victoria directly, "The deal signs in 48 hours, or Kingsley Aviation faces a liquidity crisis that no restructuring plan can contain." Victoria turned to Mara and asked her to begin a full audit of the merger filing history, starting with the supplemental agreement. Within 24 hours of the supplemental agreement surfacing, a story appeared on 3 financial news platforms describing Owen Pike as a disgruntled technician who had inherited a minority stake in a patent portfolio through a personal bequest and was now using procedural leverage to extract a windfall payment from 2 companies whose combined workforce exceeded 8,000 people. The story included a copy of a negotiation draft in which Kingsley Aviation had offered Owen $80 million to release his veto rights. Framed in the article as evidence of his demand, with no mention of the fact that Owen had declined the offer and requested that it be removed from the record entirely. By the next morning, camera crews had positioned themselves outside the entrance to Evergreen Field, and a second wave of coverage described Owen as a single father who had turned a dead mentor's legacy into a personal leverage instrument. Paige was 16 and had been around enough of her father's world to understand what the coverage was designed to do, but she was also young enough that finding messages from classmates about her father's name in news articles produced a specific kind of distress that had nothing to do with business strategy. She drove herself to Evergreen Field after school and found Owen in the hangar, working on a fuel line fitting with the quiet concentration that had always been his default state under pressure. She asked him if he was thinking about walking away from the trust to make it stop, and he admitted that he had been weighing whether the fight was worth the cost to her. Paige sat on a toolbox for a moment and then said that Samuel had given him the trust because he knew Owen would not sell the safety standards when things got uncomfortable, and that doing exactly what the coverage was pressuring him to do would simply confirm that the pressure had worked. Victoria held a public statement the following afternoon in which she confirmed that Owen had never requested compensation of any kind, that the $80 million figure had originated in a Kingsley Aviation negotiating document, that it had been declined, and that the company had not disclosed this context in any of its public communications. The statement was precise, brief, and cost her something visible with the board before she had finished reading it aloud. Margaret Ashbourne sent Victoria a message within the hour noting that voluntarily confirming a negotiating failure in front of journalists had given the board grounds to revisit the leadership question before the deal closed. Dorian began circulating privately among board members, collecting commitments for a vote that would place the merger under direct board management and effectively suspend Victoria's authority to negotiate terms. Meanwhile, Mara's technical team, conducting a parallel investigation into the grounded demonstration aircraft, had traced the deformed thermal gasket to a specific supply batch. Batch number 37 from a components vendor whose contract had been approved and expedited through procurement by a Dorian-adjacent signatory. Cross-referencing the delivery logs revealed that the same batch had supplied 12 Ether-9 engines currently installed in aircraft scheduled for the public demonstration flight. Owen called Garrett Cole at 6 in the morning, catching the Wainwright test director before he left for the facility, and told him to pull all 12 engines from service. Garrett had known Owen since the early Ether-9 development years and did not ask twice. He issued the grounding order to his team within 20 minutes and was at the storage facility himself when the first engine came off its mounting bracket. Physical inspection of the components confirmed what Owen's single gasket had suggested. The batch material was within specification at room temperature, but showed measurably reduced heat tolerance at sustained high-thrust temperatures. The exact operating range the aircraft would have been running during the ceremony's centerpiece maneuver. No engine in the batch would have failed that day. But after 200 hours of cumulative flight time in commercial service, the failure probability curve moved into territory that no airworthiness standard would have permitted. Dorian immediately contacted the Prescott Horizon team and told them the grounding was Owen's unilateral decision, unsupported by any formal airworthiness authority, and that it was interfering with a contractual demonstration requirement that Prescott had built into the loan disbursement conditions. Garrett provided Mara with the engineering documentation the same afternoon, including the original internal alert that a junior Wainwright engineer had filed 8 weeks earlier, flagging the batch material as borderline. That alert had been closed with a notation reading insufficient data to warrant action, and the authorization for that closure had come from a staff member reporting directly into the organizational structure that Dorian managed. The closed alert meant the components had proceeded through procurement, installation, and pre-flight preparation without being flagged to any airworthiness review. Victoria directed the demonstration to be canceled. She knew, as she said the words, that it triggered the loan disbursement clause and that Prescott would use it as grounds to accelerate the repayment timeline. Margaret Ashbourne convened an emergency board session that afternoon, and the opening argument from the Prescott-aligned board members was that Victoria had allowed an outside individual with no fiduciary duty to the company to effectively manage the CEO's decisions for the better part of a week. Owen, asked to address the board, said he was not managing anyone's decisions. He had exercised the rights that the founding trust documents established in the specific situations those documents were written to address, and the result had been the prevention of a safety incident that the company's own internal process had failed to catch. Dorian moved that Owen be removed as managing trustee on the grounds that he had demonstrated an inability to separate technical judgment from the financial interests of the company, and that his actions had caused material harm. Mara reviewed the trust charter and reported that removal of the managing trustee required a finding that the trustee had acted for personal financial gain, not that the trustee had made decisions that were costly to the company. Then an alert came through from the compliance monitoring system. A $2 million transfer had appeared in an investment account registered in Owen's name. Dorian laid the account documentation on the conference table with the carefully measured timing of someone who had been waiting for the right moment and had chosen it well. The account had been opened 6 days earlier, the same week Owen had declined to sign, and the funds had arrived from a series of transfers originating in an entity Dorian described as a competitor of Kingsley Aviation, presenting it, without stating it directly, as payment for a deliberate obstruction. Owen told the board he had never opened an investment account of that description and had no knowledge of the funds. Dorian suggested that Owen's reluctance to produce documentation was itself evidence that the account was real and the arrangement intentional, and that the board now had a clear basis to invoke the personal interest clause of the trust charter. Mara asked for 48 hours to trace the account's origin. Dorian said the board needed to act before the loan deadline, not after it, and called for an immediate procedural vote to suspend the trust's veto authority pending investigation. Victoria looked at Owen across the table and saw on his face not the anger she expected, but the particular calm of someone who has been set up before and knows exactly what it looks like. Owen asked her one direct question. How was it possible for a CEO to not know that her digital authorization had been used to sign a supplemental agreement that committed over $1.6 billion of her company's equity, or that her company's own data infrastructure was being used to open fraudulent accounts in the name of a third party? Victoria did not answer immediately, and the silence she sat in was the kind that comes before an honest answer, rather than a strategic one. She said she had built a system in which she had rewarded efficiency and results, while asking very few questions about how both were being produced, and that Dorian had operated within that system with complete confidence that the reward structure would protect him as long as the numbers came in. She had not been deceived by a sophisticated scheme, so much as she had built the conditions that made the scheme easy. Owen said he understood that, and that it was the only reason he was still in the room. The relationship between them shifted in that exchange in a way that neither named explicitly but both recognized. From the kind of mutual wariness that comes from opposing positions to something closer to the respect that comes from seeing how a person responds when the version of themselves they have been presenting publicly is no longer available as cover. Victoria did not ask Owen to rescue her position with the board. She asked him to help protect the technology, the workforce, and the people who would be on those aircraft once the engines were back in service. Owen said he would think about it. That same night, Mara traced the account creation metadata and found that the digital signature used to authenticate Owen's identity documents had been generated from a file server inside the Kingsley corporate network, in a directory that was not accessible to Owen but was accessible to the systems administrator who reported to Dorian's team. Dorian moved the board vote forward by 12 hours. The emergency board session convened at 7 in the morning with 3 items on the agenda: removal of Victoria Kingsley as CEO, suspension of the Hollis Pike Trust's veto authority on the grounds of conflict of interest, and ratification of the Wainwright acquisition under the original Prescott-financed structure. Dorian presented Owen first. As a skilled technician who had inherited leverage he lacked the financial sophistication to deploy responsibly, who had allowed a personal grievance over a professional slight to metastasize into a week-long obstruction of a transaction that 8,000 employees were depending on. He presented his own role as that of the person who had held the deal together against sustained interference, and he presented the $2 million account as conclusive evidence that Owen had been operating in bad faith throughout. Owen addressed the board without notes and without the biographical context that Page had suggested could be useful. He did not mention Emily, did not reference his years of declining royalty payments, did not ask the board to feel anything on his behalf. He placed his original technical report from the morning of the grounding on the table, alongside the trust's founding charter, The 3-month-old documentation request with Dorian's office as the recipient, and a chronological record of every point at which accurate information about the trust's legal structure had been suppressed or falsified. He then laid out what the Prescott side agreement would actually produce for the company's workforce within 36 months of closing, using the language of the supplemental agreement itself, and explained in precise and unhurried terms what the removal of the Hollis Pike Trust's oversight authority would mean for every aircraft flying an Ether 9 engine once the standard that Samuel had built into the licensing structure no longer applied. Garrett Cole testified on the technical findings. Cyrus Wainwright, who had driven himself to the Kingsley offices without informing his own legal team, told the board that he had agreed to sell his company because he believed the acquiring party intended to operate it, not to use it as a vehicle for transferring its most valuable asset to a capital fund that had no obligation to the people who had spent their careers building it. He said he would prefer to restructure Wainwright's debt under its own terms, even if that took several years, rather than complete a transaction that served primarily as a mechanism for moving the Ether 9 patents beyond the reach of the people who had created them. Dorian, in his final statement, held up the $2 million account transfer and said it was the only document the board needed to see. Mara walked through the door as Dorian was speaking and placed her completed trace report on the table in front of Margaret Ashbourne. The trace report was 23 pages, and Mara walked the board through it methodically, without dramatization, the way she always presented findings that were going to cause serious legal consequences for people in the room. The account had been created using a document package that included a scanned copy of Owen's passport, a copy that existed in exactly one location in any digital system, the secure merger documentation archive that Dorian's team controlled. The authentication metadata showed the account was opened from an IP address registered to a subsidiary of one of the 3 Prescott intermediary companies. The $2 million transfer itself had moved through a sequence of accounts that Mara's forensic team had mapped to a holding structure that ultimately connected back to the same Prescott network. The closed safety alert for the batch components had been authorized from a workstation in Dorian's directorate. The supplemental Prescott agreement bore Victoria's digital signature applied through a delegation token that Dorian had obtained 3 months earlier for a completely different transaction and had never returned or invalidated. And Dorian's personal compensation arrangement with Prescott, a contingency payment of $90 million, conditional on the Ether 9 licensing rights reaching the Prescott Fund, had been documented in a communication thread that had been deleted from the company's main server, but preserved on a backup system the deletion protocols had not reached. Dorian told the board that Victoria and Owen had constructed an alliance designed to remove him, and that Mara's report was the product of that alliance, not of independent investigation. Victoria stood at the head of the table and spoke without the prepared cadence she typically used in formal settings. She told the board that she had refused to shake a man's hand because of the condition of his clothes in front of a room full of people, and that she was telling them this not to generate sympathy but because it illustrated exactly the kind of judgment she had been exercising throughout the merger process, looking at surfaces, dismissing what didn't fit the picture she had already decided on, and rewarding the person who kept telling her what she wanted to hear. She said the culture that had made Dorian possible was a culture she had built and maintained, and changing it was not something she could accomplish by keeping her position through a vote that she hadn't earned with her conduct. Owen, when the board asked him whether he believed Victoria should retain the CEO role, said that was not his decision to make, and that it would not be appropriate for him to make it, but that the person who had halted a fraudulent transaction authorized an independent audit and confirmed publicly that her own company had misrepresented a negotiating position was, in his direct experience, a different kind of decision-maker than the person who had been running the company 2 weeks earlier, and that distinction mattered. The board voted to suspend Dorian pending formal investigation, rejected the Prescott-financed acquisition structure, and declined to remove Victoria pending a formal governance review. Prescott Horizon formally withdrew its financing commitment within the hour, and the merger, as it had been structured, was finished. Owen waited until the room had largely emptied, then told the board members who remained that the Hollis Pike Trust maintained a liquidity reserve, accumulated from years of royalty income that Owen had not drawn, sufficient to fund the Wainwright facility's operations for 6 months while an alternative structure was developed. Owen did not use the trust reserve as leverage or as a negotiating position. He used it as a bridge, and the condition he attached to its use was that the time it bought would be used to build a transaction that did not require anyone to choose between the company's financial survival and its obligations to the people working inside it. The restructured proposal he brought to both boards took 5 days to draft with Mara Garrett and a small team from Cyrus's office, who had been waiting to work on something that resembled the deal Cyrus had originally been told he was signing. The Hollis Pike Trust would issue a long-term exclusive license to the combined company for all Aether 9 variants at a royalty rate below market, in exchange for governance commitments rather than cash. No sub-licensing to third parties without trust approval. No specification changes without a technical review board that included trust representation. No financial signatory authority over safety-related decisions. The Wainwright workforce would receive equity participation in the combined entity on a vesting schedule tied to company performance rather than fixed compensation. Non-core assets, real estate holdings, non-aviation product lines would be sold to retire the outstanding debt, eliminating the need for outside financing entirely. A consortium of regional lending institutions, reviewing the revised structure after the fraud elements had been removed, agreed to provide bridge financing at standard commercial terms. The deal value remained at $4.4 billion. It no longer required a single dollar from Prescott Horizon. Dorian was formally terminated and referred to federal prosecutors on charges that included document fraud, unauthorized use of digital authorization credentials, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. Charges that the forensic record Mara had assembled made difficult to contest. Julian Prescott's involvement was referred to a separate investigation focused on the side compensation arrangement and the account fabrication. Margaret Ashbourne, satisfied that the transaction's legal integrity had been restored, supported Victoria's retention as CEO in the formal governance vote, which passed with the support of the Wainwright board members who had joined the combined entity's oversight structure. Victoria sent Owen the final execution copy of the amended licensing agreement the morning of the signing, with a handwritten note that said only that she had read every clause. Owen reviewed the document that afternoon, made no objections, and arrived at the signing the following morning in the same work uniform he had worn the first time. Victoria did not extend her hand when he entered the room. She waited. Owen set his folder on the table, uncapped his pen, and signed each of the pages that Mara indicated, and then he did extend his hand. Not quickly, not theatrically, but with the deliberate intention of someone who understands that a gesture can mean entirely different things depending on what has been built before it. Victoria shook it. There was no one in the room who laughed. 12 months after the signing, the combined company released an updated Ether 9 production variant with the full batch 3.7 component line replaced across every active installation, a process that had taken 6 months and cost considerably more than the original batch substitution would have, but that had been completed without a single airworthiness incident. Owen continued to serve as managing trustee of the Hollis Pike Trust, took a seat on the newly formed Independent Technical Oversight Board, and spent the majority of his working hours doing what he had done since the year after Emily died. Showing up at Evergreen Field in the morning, running diagnostics on engines that the computer showed as healthy, and listening for the frequencies that only registered in hands that had learned to pay attention. Victoria restructured the company's internal governance to require technical team representation in every maintenance and procurement meeting above a certain risk threshold, remove financial management authority over safety reporting channels, give any certified technician the power to ground an aircraft pending engineering review without management override, and tie executive compensation to workforce retention and safety performance metrics rather than transaction multiples alone. The changes were not popular with every investor, but they were the changes she had told Owen she would make, and she had learned, in the weeks between the first failed handshake and the second successful one, that telling a person what you intend to do and then doing it is the minimum requirement for the word accountability to carry any meaning at all. The scholarship program that bore Samuel Hollis's name, funded by the Trust's accumulated royalty reserve and matched by the combined company, enrolled its first cohort of engineering students that fall, drawn predominantly from the families of Wainwright's hourly technical staff. Paige Pike, who was spending her after-school hours in the Evergreen hangar working on a turbine blade restoration project of her own design, submitted an application. On the afternoon of the public engine test that inaugurated the combined company's production line, Victoria came down from the executive viewing area and walked across the hangar floor to where Owen was standing among the ground crew, within audible range of the Ether 9's startup sequence. She asked him if he still thought about the first morning they had met. Owen looked at his hands, dark along the lifeline the way they usually were by late afternoon, and said it was difficult to forget a handshake that had almost brought down a $4.4 billion deal. Victoria said he had it exactly backward. He hadn't endangered the deal. He had stopped her from signing one that would have dismantled her company from within, and the distinction between those two things was something she intended to spend the rest of her professional life keeping straight. She asked if he had plans for dinner, not to discuss patents, not to discuss the trust, and not to discuss anything that would require either of them to bring a file folder. Owen said he was interested, and that Paige's approval and his responsibilities as her father were conditions no new arrangement in his life would ever supersede, and Victoria told him she would consider that a reasonable term. When the Ether 9 reached full operating power behind them, she extended her hand without waiting for an invitation. Owen didn't wipe the oil from his palm this time, and she didn't ask him to, and the engine climbed to its test ceiling in the sound of something that had been built to last.